James Slezak.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Great to be back in Sydney. I haven't lived here for a while, but my memories of Ivy are not quite as much education and healthy eating as I think we've been having this morning. As David said, we'd like to have a bit of discussion with the full group as a sort of a panel and interactive session. But before we get into that, I thought it'd be interesting just to share with you a few thoughts and observations on the theme of digital disruption and the importance of finding the social purpose of an organisation from my experience working recently at the New York Times. I actually wanted to rewind the story a little bit and draw a parallel with some changes that were happening about 40 years ago. So you're seeing on the screen here the way that we used to produce the newspaper back in the 1970s. And the 1970s were a time of incredible technological disruption, as well as real threats to the business model of publishing. The economics were shifting in ways that were making it very difficult for publishers to maintain their competitiveness, even in big metro markets like New York City. And this process you're seeing here was about to be replaced with much less labour-intensive, much more automated forms of production of a newspaper. In fact, many of them were IBM computers that were brought in here, IBM, I think, lithographic technology to replace this hot type you're seeing here, which involves molten lead and manually putting each letter into the whatever you call these metal things. I don't even know the names of it, to be honest. In all of that technological and business model upheaval, a letter arrived. It wasn't a letter, in fact, it was the latest technology. The day was a telex, I believe, that came from the Attorney General of the United States of America to the then publisher, which is the overall chief executive of the organisation. And actually, just after I arrived at the Times in 2013, a colleague of mine found this letter, this telex, in his drawer. And it's very interesting because it actually threatens to throw the chairman in jail. It's a letter from the Attorney General objecting to the publication of some secret documents that had top secret classification. And it points out very helpfully that that's against the law and that there are some potentially very serious consequences for doing that. What had happened was a bunch of documents called the Pentagon Papers had been delivered to a reporter at the New York Times by someone who'd leaked them from inside the Department of Defense. And as you guys probably well know, and many of you may even remember it, during the 1970s the United States was in the middle of the war in Vietnam. And the story that was being told by the president at the time, President Nixon, turned out not to be fully consistent with the story that the Department of Defense and the government itself was telling its own people internally. And so when these documents arrived, obviously this was an important story, but having been threatened with these incredible legal sanctions, the publisher faced a very serious dilemma. And in the words of Punch Sulzberger, who's the grandfather of the incoming publisher of the Times, he said the entire operation smelled of 20 years to life. He was actually interviewed about this for his own obituary, which is kind of a creepy thing to do if you ever get interviewed for your own obituary. He said our lawyers were very cautious. These outside lawyers that they'd had for years, the senior partner told me if we chose to publish, his firm would just refuse to defend us. The Pentagon Papers were very long, he said, but one thing was undeniable. If I'd been in charge of that mess, I'd have tried to keep it secret too. These were extraordinary documents proving deceit of the people by their elected officials. I had no doubt that the American people had a right to read them and that we, at the Times, had an obligation to publish them. So he felt that the mission of the organisation, its social purpose, compelled him and the editors to take this decision to continue publishing these documents despite this obvious legal and business jeopardy that placed them in. That did land them in court. They fought it all the way to the US Supreme Court, and in a ultimately famous court case, the New York Times versus the United States of America, the New York Times won. So history continued. The Nixon administration didn't do so well. Tricky Dick here, I think, resigned after a couple of years. The war in Vietnam faced increasing protests as people understood that it didn't make a lot of sense, and ultimately wound down. Fast forward 40 years, and we're facing similar forms of social upheaval, similar forms of political upheaval. We're facing a presidency that has a similarly hostile relationship with the press and with journalists doing their job to try to tell the truth about things that matter. This is a tweet famously from President Trump referring to the press as the enemy, he says, but not of him, of the American people. In this political and social upheaval, we're facing similar technological shifts, and I'll talk more about the details of some of these in the lunch session for people who stick around for that. But it's a very parallel time for the organisation, for the sector in general. A lot of disruption, a lot of organisations going out of business, and the fundamental economics, not just of how we sell what we sell, but also how we produce it, shifting in ways that make much of the production process and distribution process almost unrecognisable from before. This is the way we increasingly read the newspaper, not something you would have predicted even just 10 or 15 years ago. So to cut to the lesson of this, or at least the conclusion of it, what we at the Times realised and what helped guide us through this upheaval was a recognition of fundamentally what is important about the institution and what draws customers, talent, investors and the wider community behind supporting our mission, even in the face of potentially a lot of economic and political and social opposition. To give a graphic example, this is some work actually by originally a Sydney photographer who won the Pulitzer Prize doing photojournalism for the New York Times. While the rest of the world was fleeing sub-Saharan Africa in the height of the Ebola epidemic, Daniel Burlock there grabbed his gear and got a flight in the other direction and recorded what was going on in a time of incredible threat to him and incredibly important time to get the message out about what was happening in sub-Saharan Africa. Tyler Hicks here in Libya, reporting from a war zone. This guy got captured, spent time in captivity. These guys are really putting their lives on the line, just as the organisation in some ways put its own existence on the line, to stand up really for what it's there for. And it's not just war zones and people facing horrible Ebola epidemics that the organisation and its reporters report, but it's just the everyday lives of ordinary citizens in the United States and increasingly around the world. This is a series of stories by Jody Cantor, just looking at shift workers at Starbucks and other fast food outlets, and the difficulty they have just making ends meet when their schedules weren't set in advance. And they're working 1 or 2 hours here or there, and they don't know the day before, so they can't easily work other jobs around these very difficult to predict jobs. And after this reporting, Starbucks and a number of the big employers in the United States shifted their policies and improved the lives of people like the two guys you see here. So the lesson for us was that by telling that story, not just focusing only on the way we market and the way that we price things, but actually explaining to people why what we do is important and what risks we take in bringing it to them, the organisation was able to ride through in the 2016-2017 era similar upheaval that it faced in the 1970s. And despite being held up as the enemy of the American people by some of those in powerful places opposing us, recently, the last year or so has been in fact the greatest year of growth for subscriptions and support for the wider community for the New York Times, which is becoming rapidly a digital-first successful subscriptions organisation.